Dream landing spots for the rookie class. That is what we were talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. I did tease this at the end of the last edition, but we are going to hopefully have some post-NFL draft fantasy football drafts with the OT community. Myself and Kevin Safranik also talked about running some with the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show, and we have had quite a bit of interest in both of those so far. So post-NFL draft, we will be trying to arrange some of those. So if you are interested in drafting either against myself or Shawn or myself or Kevin, do let me know. You can say it on social media at Overtime Ireland, or you can email across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'll get some of those set up over the course of the off-season. Shawn, I'm going to kick it off here with some, I guess, fantasy booking, dream case scenarios. And we're going to talk about a player who you've talked about in the past about dream scenarios, which the dream scenario may not have occurred over the last couple of hours as reporting has happened. But let's start off with one. If you could pick one player in the NFL draft to have a specific scenario of where either they land or the kind of type of environment that it would be, even if it's not team specific, who would that be and which team would it be and why?
Well, I'm going to go with TreVeyon Henderson falling to the Chiefs at 31.
It's always the Chiefs. They need a running back.
Yes.
Shawn, I regret to inform you that they're going to definitely they're going to get that running back pick wrong there. Their running back evaluations.
Well, they're going to not draft a running back in the first round, and they probably will get it wrong. But we're dreaming here, right? We had Jonathan Taylor fall to them all those years ago.
And what happened there, Shawn?
Say that again.
What happened there? Did they draft Jonathan Taylor? No.
They may have drafted a short, slow, 6th round pick caliber player, which again doesn't mean that person couldn't have hit. He had some
ample opportunity
comps too. Well, he did have that opportunity. There were some comps between Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Aaron Jones, and if you got Aaron Jones, you'd be pretty happy. A couple of years later, we had a situation where Breece Hall was going to fall to the Chiefs. In that draft, they made 2 very strong defensive selections, and so you can't really criticize that. Colm, the thing I'm concerned about in this draft is that the egregious need for the offensive line will push them into drafting for need as opposed to drafting the best possible player. Some of the times when they've drafted for need, like when they made those defensive selections, they hit. So it doesn't mean you can't do it. At the same time, take a star, right? Henderson could be their version of Jahmyr Gibbs. Having that or not having it is really what separated them. I mean, the obvious thing that separated them from some of these other teams last year is the QB play. You're thinking, the QB play, you've got Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels. You can argue for Jalen Hurts. What the teams like Buffalo, Baltimore, Philadelphia were doing with the running backs, the explosiveness, it is a controversial sort of statement to make. But outside of the Super Bowl, outside of a couple of those games in the playoffs, and the playoffs were the most important, right? He came through. Hurts did not have a particularly good season. Saquon Barkley and the explosiveness did so much for them there. You think about the Detroit Lions and having a Jared Goff, which is obviously not a Patrick Mahomes, and what the number one, the receivers he was surrounded by. The Chiefs don't have the depth of firepower that an Amon-Ra St. Brown, a Jamison Williams, a Sam Laporta gives you at this point in his trajectory. I mean, Travis Kelce is not in the same vicinity as a Sam Laporta. That matters. But you look at Jahmyr Gibbs and the explosiveness there. Henderson could be that guy for them. And I do think that would change everything, even if your offensive line remained weak, which again, one of the things that listeners are going to be thinking through right here is that, okay, well, the Lions have a much stronger offensive line than the Chiefs. Those two things go together to an extent. What's much more likely, Colm, is that they will use a later pick on the running back position. And I think that Henderson probably is going to go before that. I know that he is perhaps less locked in than Hampton, but I guess I wouldn't be surprised if he goes ahead of Hampton in the draft. either, you're going to be looking at all of these other tiers that we talked about on Monday. And so this ends up not being all that specific, but it does illustrate why they wouldn't take Henderson in the first round when you have other needs, and how this draft is so much fun. Colm, if I could pick any kind of situational element for my hometown team, it matters to me. We talked about how one of the great things about the draft is the fandom perspective, but also for fantasy, because it's been very, I guess lame would be a way to put it, but it's been frustrating to have this team in the Kansas City Chiefs that is not giving you a fantasy weapon. It's gross to see players like Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt benefiting from the fact that you can run out there for Kansas City. And because of the way the injuries happened, those guys did actually have very high expected points. So in this case, that's fantasy expected points last year. But my dream scenario would be that you go through this draft and the Chiefs do not somehow miss on taking one of Bashal Tutin, D.J. Giddens, R.J. Harvey, or Brashard Smith. Those 4 guys, one of them has to end up on the Kansas City Chiefs by the end of this draft.
So I have a few scenarios that I want to get like some takes from Shawn Siegele on who these players should land with. Shawn, you named out all the other running backs that I was going to ask you. So you want them all on the Chiefs is kind of the answer that we've got.
We want one of them. One of those guys. Don't end up with
the one thing that I'm hoping through this. There's a lot of guys that we like. One of my things before the NFL draft is always just don't put 2 of the guys we love on the same. One team drafted the 2 of them, put it into a committee instantly behind a veteran. I would like that not to happen. I was going to go to the tight end. You don't want to
have both Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis, 2 very fun prospects behind our favorite running back in the entire NFL.
That's basically like the Hall of Fame example of it, Shawn, I think. And it's only 1 year into that Hall of Fame example. If we look at those running backs, so Shawn, I think obviously the Chiefs always feels like a place where there's more to be added by the running backs. And if you had somebody in there, it would be hugely exciting for fantasy. If I'm looking around the rest of the NFL at the dream spots where I'm like, just draft one of these guys, draft your guy that's going to be your running back. Do not add, I could get the GM fired here, but don't add any depth behind him, please. But the Broncos and the Washington Commanders are the 2 where I think we could just have a gold mine there if we get one of these kind of running back talents that we like landed in those spots. It cannot be Henderson because you've already sent him to the Chiefs. Who would have the biggest upside in one of those 2 offenses?
Well, I think if you put Harvey with the Denver Broncos, then he's going to be like the running back 7 in 2025.
Overall?
That would be a lot of fun. Overall.
Okay, let's go. We'll get on board to that. We'll draft him in the second round, early second round of our dynasty leagues and win some championships.
I do think that, you said I kind of blew it by putting Henderson already with the Chiefs. I do think that Henderson to Denver is that situation that ends up being the massive league winner. That one is much more realistic. The Broncos are already kind of setting the stage for taking a running back in the first round, which probably not the way that they should go any more than many of these other teams. But
it would be exciting, Shawn. It'd be very exciting.
Yeah, it would be. Now, we do have this question of, is the Sean Payton dynamic going to continue? It was an absolute bloodbath last year. It was probably the very worst fantasy recommendation that I've ever given in 15 years, which was to draft the Denver running backs. Maybe the very worst one of all time. One of the things
the ugliest 3-way split that you could imagine. We talk about players who are getting kind of caught from different ends and their roles disappearing. The Broncos running backs were just making each other's roles disappear and then performing so badly that they were losing the ability to demand touches.
Well, if they had taken every snap last year and simply sprinted for the opposite end zone, it would have scored about the same number of points.
The positive was that Marvin Mims got factored into some of the backfield touches, which was productive. Very positive.
So I do think we have the same question with Denver that we have with Kansas City. One of the things that's interesting, one of the reasons why I do think it's somewhat likely the Chiefs will take one of those guys, another interesting name for Kansas City probably is Jaden Blue. But they keep talking about how you need to be a good receiver. That was one of the elements that led them to the Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick. I don't know if Kansas City themselves realizes that they don't run their offense that way anymore since they've had Patrick Mahomes. We're going to have that same question with the Broncos in this new version of Denver, where you have Bo Nix and his specific competencies. You have an adjustment league-wide of how defenses are attacking certain things. I don't know that we can necessarily say that Broncos are going to be this sort of fantasy utopia situation, but it would be exciting. Colm, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cincinnati Bengals are both talking about adding a running back. Do you have any specific running backs that you think would be both good for them in reality and would also complement our guys and Jalen Warren and Chase Brown in such a way that it doesn't hurt them too badly?
Yeah, what I'm hoping is we talked on the show on Monday about teams who have like a group of like 10 running backs where they're like, we'll just wait for the last guy. I would kind of prefer it to be some of those names so they can kind of help our, two of our preferred guys to not get completely crushed. But the list is still going to be quite interesting, I think, as we look ahead. Both of those teams have set it up that they're going to take a running back, and when they're talking it as early as they are, I think that it's going to be a case that they take them not in the first round, but I think in day 2 most likely. Just before we go into players, do you think that are you fearing a day 1 pick here for either of those teams?
No,
I think if you're looking at the Bengals, like the Steelers don't need it as much on the defensive side of the ball. Like the Bengals need some defensive help there. They spent all their money on their wide receivers and quarterback. I think that they need to address multiple other areas prior to the running back. And that's why I think they'll probably go for one of those later day guys. I think the Steelers probably have they probably have the luxury if they want to go, day 2 in that direction. I don't think they'll go day 1. But I think we're looking at one of those guys that's in the maybe from Caleb Johnson downwards and that kind of tier of running back.
Yes, I think that you could get someone like an Ollie Gordon to complement Chase Brown. I think you get someone like a Jarquez Hunter to complement a Jalen Warren. Maybe slightly more exciting names if we want to go that direction. I think it could work for both players and wouldn't be catastrophic if the Steelers added Dylan Sampson and the Bengals added Devin Neal.
And to be clear on that, like I think both of those starting running backs, they do need complementary pieces. I don't think either of them's going to handle like 80% of the workload. I do think it's a case that they need those complementary pieces, but I'm hoping that the complementary pieces aren't in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft to completely supersede them. The other team, Shawn, that I mentioned was the Commanders. You've kind of moved RJ Harvey already, but you mentioned Tootin and Giddens. Is there one of those that you would like to see land with Jaden Daniels?
Well, let's put Giddens there, right? I think he can be a 3-down back who is an absolute superstar. And if you're in this offense where the entire defense is going to be focusing on Daniels, he's the type of player who has the explosiveness and the game-breaking ability to really benefit. We've watched Brian Robinson create big plays, and yet if you have more of an athletic threat, if you have a Giddens back there, I think you've got more dynamism at the second level, the ability to make guys miss. You also have more of a home run threat. He would be a perfect additional piece in a backfield that's already reasonably talented in Washington.
Yeah, we also, you mentioned like Brian Robinson, who's at a much earlier point of his career than Austin Eckler. We've seen Austin Eckler like miss quite a chunk of time last season, but also 35 receptions and 77 carries. I think there's a huge amount of upside for him in Washington. So I'm excited. That's one of the picks I'm most excited to see who lands there. But the other side of that, as I mentioned, kind of scenarios where players can land on top of each other. And I do think Washington, they're limited on picks, which might be their issue. But if they move back, they may be able to pick up a couple of additional picks, and I could see them then going multiple ways. But they're very, very short on draft picks here for the NFL draft. The other position, Shawn, the tight end position, you have Colton, Loveland, you have Tyler Warren. Both of them obviously getting significant buzz. When we look through this first round, and I know it's not always the most obvious situation where players can go and have success, but when I'm looking down through it, there isn't a real team in the top end of the first round of the NFL draft. And then when you start to go through it further, you start to get into situations where you're like, well, they have, like we talked about the Broncos, they've just acquired Evan Ingram in free agency. The Packers, for example, have a number of tight ends that they're probably happy with. The Vikings, have TJ Hawkinson come back from his injury. But if you go to like the Colts, we're not excited about the Colts QB situation. There's a lot of teams when we look down through it, I feel like either the offensive outlook or they don't need a tight end. They kind of have their guy. Is there one spot where you're like, it'd be a really nice landing spot here for a tight end? I'm looking at you're getting down to the Chargers. I think could be a pretty interesting spot for one of these guys. But is there any teams in specific that you're thinking, I hope one of these guys lands there?
Well, the Jaguars could move back and make one of the picks, I think. And then you're really looking at the Jets and the Saints as being two teams where if you add a star tight end, it probably just completely changes what you can do offensively. We know there with the Jets that you have a head coach who has just watched the value of both an elite running game, and they seem to have that portion of it set up there in New York. But if you put a Sam Laporta type of player in it as well, one of the hacks the Detroit Lions really felt that they found in that draft when they selected both Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs, and one of the things that they were criticized for in taking both of those guys was that they thought that that was going to be the way to attack the evolving NFL defenses. Partly it probably was that. Partly it's just that when you have that much talent and you have a good coordinator, you're going to see all of those things create a synergy and have some success. Do they have the ability to do those things with Justin Fields? Isn't going to be, that type of an offense. I mean, what you're hoping to see from New York now is to be able to take some of the things that Detroit was able to do and combine them with some of the things that these elite offenses with the hybrid QBs are able to do. We know that Justin Fields has some limitations as a passer, and yet I continue to go back to the 2023 season where DJ Moore and Cole Kmet really flourished with him leading the way. So I think that you can do some things with that style of offense and with him being the guy who runs it to where the Jets could be exciting this next year, where we're talking about Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, and then a tight end as being this, 1, 2, 3, this triplets type of punch along with Fields. I really want to see the Jets be aggressive on offense and attack, as opposed to what we got from the Pittsburgh Steelers last year, where everyone, it's not that there's not a lot of competency there in the head coach. You could even argue that this was a great sort of style of offense for Arthur Smith. You can argue that Justin Fields is best when he's protected, but we saw what they did in that first month and a half, where the offense was bland enough that they decided, okay, well, maybe Russell Wilson will help things. That's not the answer, right? I mean, if you're going to have Justin Fields out there, go out there, attack, try and do what the Detroit Lions have done. I think that's the way to go about it. The Saints are an interesting play, and that they just need so many things that I don't have any problem with them going the other direction. But if you get by those teams, then I think you are starting to look at teams either trading up or certainly there, as you mentioned, the Indianapolis Colts are another very clear.
And I know I talked about on the Monday episode, like players can change franchise trajectories quite quickly. Some of these tight ends landing in some of the situations we've talked about there, I think negatively is going to affect their stock here, certainly for year one in a dynasty aspect.
So you're not super fired up about these tight ends landing with hybrid QBs?
No, to be honest, I wouldn't be all that worried about the New York situation. But we've talked about it, and that's doesn't come out very well. The Jaguars, there's a lot of buzz around Brenton Strange. Maybe that's not going to lead to anything. And we've talked in the past about trying to have as many of these good players on your rosters to make your roster better as possible. But might be like a little bit of a down scenario for these guys. I think the teams aren't going to want, or the players aren't going to want to slide in the first round, but I think some of the better landing spots are probably later in the round, unless teams trade up. But I think it's going to be interesting to see where those names land, and then to gauge our level of excitement post NFL draft. I guess the one thing with the tight end position versus the wide receiver position, sometimes you can make up for those targets, particularly in tight end premium, but we probably would have felt a very similar way last year, Shawn, when you get Brock Bowers to the Raiders, and you're like, well, this is a terrible offense with terrible offensive scenario, and then all the coaches are going to get fired. So we can then do the Brock Bowers thesis post NFL draft with the bad landing spots for these tight ends. That's what you're telling me?
Yeah, and you look through, we tend to be, I think, overly confident even in the first round. If Brock Bowers can fall to where he fell in last year's draft, then certainly someone like Colton Loveland could fall to the Houston Texans, which would be a very fun landing spot as they try and put together the overall firepower around CJ Stroud to create a bounce back season for him and really get that franchise that has a dynamic defense and can shut people down. You talk about helping them jump back to where they're in that mix with the Ravens, the Chiefs, certainly the Bills. One more playmaker on offense, and certainly if it's a playmaker who does other things and allows your offense to be multifaceted, that would be pretty exciting.
Yeah, so Shawn's going to put him to the Texans at 25. I'm going to have the Chargers take him just before that at 22. So we're going to see where we come out, but it will be fun to see where they land up. Shawn, is there any other player we didn't touch on that you're really, there must be a player where you're like, I really hope this scenario, this landing spot is good for this player. Who is that player?
Well, Colm, where do you want to see McMillan go?
Well, it's obviously a first round selection, and I would not mind, like we're putting everyone here to the Broncos. I wouldn't mind him going to the Broncos. I think he probably goes off the board prior to that. I don't want to see him go to the Cardinals. I don't want to see him go to the Bengals. Let's put him to the Cowboys.
So that would be the team, right? I'm seeing Matthew Golden as a potential option there for Dallas. You can certainly understand why they would want that speed threat to go with a CD Lamb. But Lamb does everything so well. Wouldn't you want?
So you're saying that you want McMillan to the Cowboys as well?
That's the place that makes sense. One of the things as you look through this is that if you don't go there, then you are in position to potentially fall, which is one of the reasons that people are saying that he could be a big faller, right? You work through some of these teams. If he goes to the Seahawks, they don't have a quarterback, but they do already have JSN and Cooper Kupp. He's obviously not going to go to the Bengals. The Cardinals are probably not going to dip in again there. The Buccaneers are full.
Doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
The Packers? Can we get him to fall to 23? I would, that, like, if I'm saying, when you're doing your Chiefs scenarios, I'll take him in Green Bay, please.
So Green Bay is being talked about as a team where they're going to finally draft or try to draft a true number one. They're trying to do it in a draft that doesn't have a lot of those
tree, though, Shawn.
It's just going to be Jaden Reed, right? You're just going to have these guys take a step forward. Did you feel like it was receivers who were the problem last year? I know we had a lot of drops And drops do end drives.
They do.
But these Green Bay Packers receivers get open.
They get open.
If not for the Christian Watson injury, this idea of them trying to get a top wide receiver would seem ridiculous to me.
It would seem ridiculous.
But he is hurt, so that doesn't matter.
But to be honest, like Christian Watson hasn't at any point shown that he can be the standout wide receiver one on the offense. Jordan Reed felt like he, with his rookie year, potentially could be that, but then had a down year last year. The Packers, offensively, the biggest issue has been like they've getting open is not the problem. Catching the ball is the problem. And then with the drops, a lot of those aren't actually on Jordan Love. Obviously, there's some of them that could be better placed, but a lot of them are on calling it out. They're on Wicks and Reed. And like, if you do not drop those balls, the offense stays on the field. The ball keeps moving down the field, and you likely score more points. So I think that in terms of like replacing, like if Reed becomes your wide receiver too, I think the offense is in a much better place. But I'm not, there's no expectation for me that they're going to get McMillan here unless, a stock with NFL teams is falling off quite a bit.
Well, you can get from where he's being projected to the 23rd pick pretty easily. And then,
but you probably can't do that if the Packers try and trade out of the first round.
The thing that I'm looking at with Green Bay is simply that the injury to Jordan Love in the first game wrecked the season. And you're not going to pass successfully when you simply hand the ball to Josh Jacobs every time. And then,
again, we haven't fully gone into it, and this is obviously just talking about do they need a wide receiver. The other trouble is because there was the drops, and it might be like not in subconsciously done, but like the coaches when they're calling the plays, if you're like, we need to get 3 yards here and the wide receivers keep dropping the ball, let's just give it to Josh Jacobs, like whether you get it or not. Let's just do a tight end sneak with Tucker Kraft to try and get it, because we can't do a short route to make sure they catch it because they're probably going to drop the ball. Like the offense got so out of whack in terms of leaning on the run game, and I have to think that some of that is on the team and the wide receivers not being able to catch the ball, Shawn.
It's on the coaching staff not playing free and easy like they did in the second half of 2023. And I think that, again, stems back to that injury. Reed also seemed to spend most of the season injured after he had the injury trouble in the first game as well. Those two dynamics probably changed everything for them, but you can't play scared, and drafting the wide receiver one isn't going to change that dynamic. But I do think they will change
playing scared because the wide receivers can't catch the ball, shot. I'll stick to that point.
Yeah. So we'll see. It would be fun to have yet another good receiver on the Packers, because that is a team that I expect to be very dynamic in 2025. Colm, I can't wait. This is going to be so much fun.
Yeah, we are on the doorstep. You may even be listening to this just as you're getting ready to watch round one of the NFL draft. Enjoy the draft. Hopefully we get some exciting rookie landing spots. There is no doubt in my mind that we certainly will throughout the course of the NFL draft. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.